Betty Chidley, the witch. The Ambler family lived a quiet, hard-working life on their farm in Wilderley, a small village nestled near Pulverbatch. Their days were filled with good, honest hard work, tending to the fields, caring for the livestock, and preparing food to sustain themselves through the long hours of labor. But one story, passed down through generations, would mark their family as forever touched by the unexplainable. Not far from their farm, at the bottom of Betchcott, stood a tiny, worn-down cottage, home to an old woman named Betty Chidley. Betty was known throughout the village as an odd figure. Some called her a beggar, wandering from house to house in search of food or favors. Others whispered that she had unnatural powers and was frequently called a witch, although no one could prove it. Many gave her what she asked for, not out of kindness, but out of a subtle fear of earning her ire. People were quite superstitious in those days. Betty often visited the Amblers, knowing they were generous despite their modest means. Most days, Mrs. Ambler would hand her a loaf of bread, a jug of milk, or whatever else she could spare. Betty always left satisfied, her eerie demeanor lingering in the farmhouse long after she had left. One crisp morning, Betty arrived unannounced. Mrs. Ambler was in the kitchen, busy preparing a warm supper for the calves. The pot on the hearth bubbled with a great-smelling mix of meal and fresh milk, stirred slowly over the fire. Betty lingered by the door, watching intently. "That smells good," she remarked, her voice gravelly yet steady. "I wouldn't mind a taste of that myself." She licked her lips and stared at the pot, as if doing so would assure she would receive some for herself. Mrs. Ambler, weary from a long week and caught off guard by the interruption, replied curtly, "This isn't for you, Betty. It's for the calves. I don't have extra to give today." She knew she went too far, but there was too much to do that day to tend to a beggar. Betty's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the pot. "Suit yourself," she said, her tone cold and even. As she turned to leave, she added quietly, "But the calves won't eat it now." Mrs. Ambler frowned, shaking off the remark as the bitter words of a disappointed woman. But when the maid carried the steaming pail to the barn, something strange happened. The calves, usually eager and noisy at feeding time, backed away from the food. They sniffed the air cautiously but refused to touch the meal. Confused, the maid returned to the kitchen. "They won't eat," she said, setting the untouched pail on the floor. Mrs. Ambler frowned. "That can't be right. They must be hungry." She stirred the mixture again, ensuring nothing was amiss, and sent the maid back to the barn. "Try again, please," she said. But the result was the same. The calves sniffed, balked, and turned away, as if they sensed that the food was poison. A third attempt was made, this time with a freshly prepared batch, which came from a portion of the family's own food for that day. Mrs. Ambler herself accompanied the maid, confident the animals would finally eat. But to her dismay, the calves repeated their strange behavior, retreating from the food as if it were tainted. Panic began to set in. By now, Betty's parting words echoed in Mrs. Ambler's mind. Could it be possible? Was this her doing? The farmer's wife, reluctant to believe in such things, felt a growing unease. Desperation overcame doubt, and she sent her eldest son running to fetch Betty from her cottage. When Betty arrived, she stood in the barn with her arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "What is it you want from me?" she asked, feigning ignorance. Mrs. Ambler pleaded, "Please, Betty, bless the calves so they'll eat. They haven't touched a bite, and I'm worried for their health." Betty's expression didn't soften. "Me, bless your calves," she said with a chuckle. "What do I have to do with them?" The family begged, offering apologies for the earlier slight and promising to make amends. Betty let the moment linger for the longest time. Finally, she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Fine, my God bless the calves." But the calves remained indifferent to the food. Frustrated, Mrs. Ambler cried, "No, Betty, not, my God. Just say, 'God bless the calves.'" Betty raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a white grin. "And why should I?" she asked. "Please," Mrs. Ambler implored, "just say it. We'll give you whatever you need. Milk, bread, anything." After a long pause, Betty sighed dramatically and finally gave in to the request. God bless the calves, she said, her tone flat but deliberate. The change was immediate. Mrs. Ambler took the pail herself and approached the calves, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. As she entered the barn, the animals' demeanor shifted. They stepped forward eagerly, their noses twitching at the scent of the meal. One by one, they began to eat with great hunger, their earlier hesitation forgotten. Relief washed over the Ambler family. They thanked Betty, offering her bread and milk as a token of their gratitude. Even though they blamed her for creating the problem in the first place, Betty accepted with a smile, her sharp eyes glinting in the dim barn light. From that day forward, the Amblers never turned Betty away. Whether she asked for food, clothing, or even a bit of coin, they always gave. The story of the bewitched calves became a legend in the family, told and retold through the years as a reminder of Betty's mysterious power and the wisdom of staying in her good graces. For the villagers of Wilderley, it was another tale to add to the lore surrounding Betty Chidley, the enigmatic woman from the bottom of Betchcot, whose presence could bring both fear and awe. And though she was long gone, her name lived on, whispered with a mix of fear and fascination whenever her story was told.